Hello and welcome to the Japan Politics Podcast. Now today I want to touch a bit on the situation that's happening in Iran, and obviously this is an ongoing situation. Some would call it a war, although some within the American administration are sort of downplaying the possibility of that, but it certainly seems like there's obviously unfortunately casualties and it's an ongoing situation, so it seems much like a war. But I want to look a bit at what this current situation is going to mean for Japan and what some possible implications are for Japan, given that this is obviously, as well as being a specific conflict, it has big international implications. So I suppose the first question to really think about is there any possibility whatsoever of Japan getting involved militarily in any aspect in this Iran situation? Well, the headline I would say, in my opinion, is no. But I say that because there's sort of differing conclusions about, or differing opinions floating around online about what exactly is happening right now as of today and how likely the war is to either escalate or... I mean, Trump has made statements that sort of indicating that the war is winding down, but you could sort of... There's a lot of speculation as to sort of what path is most likely from here, whether things are going to escalate, where it's going to drag on as like a long conflict, where blows go back and forth without sort of it escalating to sort of boots on the ground, for example, or could effectively the USA just declare victory and pull out. There's sort of disagreement as to what possible outcomes are. But I say basically that Japan's very unlikely to be involved in any way is because, well, I mean, legally they can't. I mean, Japan does, of course, have one of the largest, most well-equipped militaries in the world, but legally it can't be called a military, it's a self-defense force, and so it would be stretching the limits of, even if there was a will, if there was a desire, which I can't imagine there really is, to get involved in this conflict from Japan. Legally, that would be very difficult. Now, Japan, the most recent conflict internationally I can remember them being involved with is Iraq, but that's a very sort of different situation where effectively the offensive element of the Iraq war meant much quicker, and America gained effectively control to some extent on the ground, and then it was sort of dealing with sort of insurrection and maintaining control, and continuing an occupation was more the concern. Very obviously, this is not the case in Iran, and even then, Japanese forces were sort of more of a sort of peacekeeping force and sort of involved in logistics rather than, you know, actively being there as offensive troops in any way. That wasn't really their purpose with which they were sent to Iraq. Now, of course, there is going to be a meeting later on this month in March that is scheduled between Sanae Takaichi, the Prime Minister of Japan, and Trump. However, although Trump at times can be very demanding and sort of has been accused of sort of seeing relationships in terms of what he can extract from people in sort of, you know, his deal-making aspect, it's hard to imagine that even from Trump that he would be looking to extract realistically much in the way of military assistance from Japan. It might be he would ask more assistance, but not necessarily any sort of active military involvement, because I think Sanae Takaichi has a very good relationship with Trump. It's broadly known that the state of the military in Japan and its legal status, and so I don't think he would put Sanae in a position where he would ask her something that's, you know, politically and legally impossible for her to give in terms of actual military assistance. But that sort of neatly brings us along to how this could affect Japan's military going forward. Now, the obvious is that this situation with Iran, it adds to the impression of sort of overall global chaos and uncertainty, and so that maybe adds a little bit to the argument that maybe Japan does need its own like self-sufficient military. And it's been very much speculated that Sanae Takaichi might want to have a referendum to sort of legalise Japan's military and make it something that's constitutionally recognised, rather than the current situation where it's sort of existing, as I say, as something that's described as just a defensive force, and to sort of get around Japan's constitution. And that's something that her sort of mentor, Shinzo Abe, very much wanted to do, have a referendum on this issue. And so that's... Given the scale of the majority Sanae Takaichi has, there's a lot of speculation that she could look to do that in the future. And so this situation, you could argue, makes this more prescient, more relevant in terms of, you know, there's global chaos. Maybe that adds to the argument that Japan needs a military on its own. Although I suppose there's a bit of a tightrope there, because as I say, it's hard to imagine that there's going to be a desire from Sanae Takaichi to get involved in this. But if there's the perception that this was in any way, or if there was to be a referendum, and that's, as far as I know, just speculative at the moment, but if it was to happen fairly rapidly in the future, if there was even the suggestion that it was happening because there was a possibility of Japanese soldiers being more involved in global conflicts, that would very much, you'd think, add to the argument against it passing, given that Japan has this long history of pacifism. This would be very much a big step forward for Japan, a big constitutional political development for them to have a legally recognised military in of itself would be a big step. And so the possibility of being involved in global conflict, even as perception, would be politically incredibly volatile. And so it's sort of a tightrope. It's sort of this situation of sort of global, as I say, chaos, uncertainty, adds to the argument that maybe Japan does need to be a bit more self-sufficient or robust in having its own military. But as I say, that would be a dangerous perception if it was even thought that Japan might be getting involved in these conflicts in the near future. Something very interesting that's come out of this conflict is there's been speculation that sort of missile anti-air intervention equipment and technology could be taken from South Korea to sort of aid this sort of conflict in the Middle East. That's been talked about, and I believe the South Korean president even commented on this, and I think he said something to the effect of something like South Korea is going to have to be more self-sufficient, which is quite a statement from him. And if I were to be the one who was to run the yes argument in terms of legalizing Japan's military, if I was to be involved in that campaign, you could do a lot worse than just simply putting out news stories saying that, you know, the USA is taking military technology from South Korea and putting it into the Middle East and effectively taking assets away from South Korea. And, you know, the South Korean president, you know, saying they need to be more self-sufficient. I think that sort of makes an argument in of itself that maybe Japan needs to look to their own defences a little bit more. And it's sort of a stark reminder of just how important the American security relationship is, how incredibly important military assets belonging to the US are, and the sort of personnel and bases stationed on Japan, and that relationship is so crucial, particularly given that Japan doesn't have a legally recognised military. It's sort of a situation like this, both the chaos and that situation in South Korea really amplifying it, really focus the attention on that. And there's of course the economic aspect also to consider for Japan. Now, this sort of, for me at least, it puts my mind of the 1973, the 1970s oil crisis that very much affected Japan. Obviously, Japan does have some capacity. They have a Japan X, I think, a petroleum company, but they're very much reliant, Japan, on imports, particularly when it comes to things like resources like oil and petroleum. Although positively, unlike the 1970s, I think Japan has much more of a stockpile of sort of an emergency reserve built up that they could look to possibly use in this situation. But obviously it's very troubling if this situation is to continue in terms of how it could affect Japan and its economy and its resources. Because already Japan is sort of in a time of inflation already. It's already having a bit of a difficulty with the cost of living. And it would be interesting to see if there'll be things like shortages in the shop, and the price of petroleum, I believe, has already gone up within Japan. I think it's gone up by something like 25%. So it'd be interesting to see if that continues, or if Japan will be tempted to either release the oil reserve, which they do have, to sort of lower the price and ensure that people can still, you know, top up at the pump, or if they would be tempted to consider other methods, like, for example, subsidising the cost, which, if they were to consider, I'm not aware if that's something they're actively looking at or not. That would add yet more debt. And bear in mind, Japan already has a problem with inflation, which this crisis is going to add to. It already has a weak yen, which makes bringing in imports more difficult and expensive. And on top of that, it's looking to actively spend more on the SDF, Japan's self-defense force. That's a plan that's in Sanae Takaichi wants to do. She also wants to lower the consumption tax on food to make that more affordable for Japanese citizens. And also, she currently still, even before those measures have come into place, already has a bit of a concern about the amount of debt that Japan has. So just imagine adding on the potential implications of things getting more expensive when she's trying to do that, and the possibility of having to subsidise petrol and things getting more expensive added to that. It's a very much a volatile mix if this situation were to continue. and it could be made worse if the situation involving the Strait of Hormuz is to carry on in a situation where shipping just can't get through, and so oil and other goods can't be transported through that strait. I believe currently the country that is to some extent able to get through the Strait of Hormuz is China. But again, that doesn't necessarily help Japan, given that they're already in something of a soft trade war where China is taken a front with Sanae Takaichi's words about Taiwan, and the possibility that they might get involved in that situation, and consider that a sort of an existential threat for Japan if China were to militarily get involved in Taiwan, and that's caused them to cut off tourism to China, and also rare earth materials to some extent being cut off to Japan. And so if that situation with the straits continue, obviously that could make it very difficult and more expensive for Japanese industry and the cost of living in Japan. So that's very much a situation to worry about. It'll also be interesting to see if there's situations aside from petroleum where there's sort of panics or shortage in the shops. For example, I think in the 1970s, I think there was like stockpiling and people panic buying toilet paper and shortages of toilet paper. Which I believe also came up in other countries during COVID. That always seems to happen, despite the fact that I believe most toilet paper is, in most countries, I think, produced domestically, or at least in Japan I think it is as well. But there always seems to be this sort of psychological effect where people are worried about scarcity in these sort of crisis situations. So hopefully that won't happen this time, but it often seems to pop up in these situations, as I say. And so this is a very sort of a difficult thing for Sanae Takaichi to navigate on the whole, as well as the military aspect being very difficult, given that she's Trump's ally. Although Trump, of course, has ruled out, to give one example, I believe the UK sort of went back and forth a little bit on whether they would be involved. At first, Keir Starmer ruled it out, but then he somewhat became defensively involved given the attacks on the UK bases in Cyprus. And this prompted Trump to say, afterwards, that he had no interest in the UK getting involved and he would win the war without them. It sort of creates a situation where I don't know if Trump has any sort of intentions to ask other countries if this conflict does continue to get involved. But Japan could maybe point to that and say, well, how come you want us to get involved? You ruled out Britain getting involved, as one example. But again, I've no idea if Trump has any plans to ask the Japanese to get involved in any sense, but it's just sort of something to speculate about, particularly as I say, this meeting's coming up. If it were to happen in any sense, that would be difficult, of course, for Sanae Takaichi, given how important, as I say, the security trade relationship with Japan is, and how they personally appear to have, Sanae Takaichi and Donald Trump, quite a good relationship. So she'll want to very much to preserve that, particularly given that she at times has said she wants to double down and sort of have even closer times with the USA. That's a very much an imperative thing for her to worry about. And although it could be to some extent helpful with the referendum, because it sort of focuses minds, as I say, in terms of thinking, well, if the USA is distracted, look what could be happening if they might be considering taking assets out of South Korea for this Middle East conflict. Could that mean that we're more exposed as a result? That sort of focuses the mind, as well as just in a general sense that there's sort of more global chaos. There's more sort of conflicts arising with Ukraine and now this Middle East conflict. It might make Japan think that even on top of the existing worries they had about this situation with China, we maybe really need to focus on our sort of military situation. So in a strange way, it might help possibly with sort of focusing the mind and sort of helping Sanae Takaichi, if she wants to have this referendum, make that argument to the people. It's just she very much you would think, want to avoid the perception that Japan in any way would consider getting involved in this at the moment. And then, as I say, you very much the economic thing where she, from that point of view, Sanae Takaichi is going to be hoping that sort of Trump might just de-escalate tensions and hopefully, from a Japanese perspective, things would get more back to a more stable base where oil can be back, where trading can resume through the Strait of Hormuz, because otherwise that's going to really create a situation where Japan might have to consider releasing that petroleum reserve. And although if this were to go on for a very long time, this tension, that could present real difficulties if that were to ever get low, and if Japan would have to consider anything like subsidies, that could be very costly, given, as I say, Japan already has this debt problem. So that's going to be a real problem if this goes on for any length of time, really. And finally, another aspect I think is very much an energy one, because the LDP has sort of recently become more pro-nuclear, and there's a lot of noise about sort of bringing more nuclear power plants up online, and to sort of give sort of a stable base of sort of less polluting energy in Japan, despite obviously, given what happened in Fukushima, historically that being kind of controversial for a thing to consider. This, given the situation with the petroleum, given the uncertainty of importing goods, given the Strait of Hormuz being enclosed, given sort of the situation with China and sort of them cutting off rare earths, and possibility of could that even escalate further, this sort of trade situation with China, the importance of having a stable nuclear base of energy production. Again, that could be another situation where it really focuses the minds, and where maybe people in more stable times might sort of be more worried about the safety of nuclear power, about whether it's a good idea to be involved in that, about potentially local communities being worried about having nuclear power near them. A situation like this, as I say, might focus the mind and make people change their opinion on this and be more open to the possibility of nuclear power. So again, if this is an agenda that the LDP is going to consider pursuing, it, getting more nuclear power in Japan, in a way that could help them, and it could make them the Japanese public potentially more amenable to that, given this incredible situation that's going on. So that's another aspect to consider that might affect Japan going forward. And so there are other aspects apart from, of course, the situation with Japan's alliance and close ties with America, the military and the referendum aspect, and the economy to think about. I mean, for example, there's sort of the broader diplomatic position of Japan, what this means for their relations with other countries, and sort of their ties to the Middle East, for instance, what this could do to sort of global markets. Could it affect the price of the yen, which is already something of a historic low, which creates sort of economic difficulties for Japan. But hopefully that gives you just a few sort of brief overview of some sort of the really pressing issues that are sort of in Sanae Takaichi's inbox. And so for very much those reasons, I think on the whole she'll very much be hoping this sort of situation goes away, and a more peaceful, stable position presents itself. But if it continues, those are some of the things she's going to have to worry about. But yeah, hopefully that gives you just a brief overview of the ways in which this incredibly volatile situation, this conflict in Iran, does affect Japan, and what it can mean going forward if it's not resolved. But this has been the Japan Politics Podcast, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Sayonara, goodbye.